This is a statue of Johnny Reb. Johnny Reb wasn't a real person. It was a generic nickname for the average Confederate soldier. It was the Southern equivalent of G.I. Joe, which is exactly why the United Daughters of the Confederacy used it, so they can romanticize the Confederates while avoiding scrutiny attached to a real person's name. What did you learn about the Civil War in high school? Maybe it was a war over states' rights. Maybe it was the noble North fighting the evil slave-holding South. Or maybe it was Lincoln freeing all the slaves with the stroke of a pen. And I'm sure it was different depending on where you were taught it. I'm sure the education in the North is a lot different than the education in the South. Here's the problem. None of that is the full story, and they're missing the most important part about American history. This year marks 250 years of the founding of America, and we're living in the most divisive times since the 1860s. So it begs the question, what could we learn about that time? How did the deadliest period of America start? And what was the true reason so many Americans died? W.E.B. Du Bois laid this out in 1935 in a book called Black Reconstruction. He pointed to something most history books skip entirely. While the war was happening, enslaved people across the South started walking off plantations by the hundreds of thousands. They crossed Union lines, refused to keep working the fields, and many picked up rifles and joined the fight themselves. Du Bois called it a general strike, the largest one in history. Almost 4 million enslaved people withdrawing their labor from a system that depended on it completely. This crippled the Confederate economy, and it gave the Union an army. By the end of the war, around 200,000 black soldiers had fought for their own freedom. So no, it wasn't abolitionists who freed the slaves. Du Bois was blunt about this. Abolitionists never had the numbers. What freed the slaves was the slaves themselves. And in doing so, they decided the war. And that raises a question worth sitting with. What does it actually mean to be American? If a nation belongs to the people who fought, bled, and built it, then the 4 million people who freed themselves and then went on to build entirely new governments have as much claim to this nation as anyone in 1776, maybe even more. So if the Civil War was won by the people who'd been enslaved, what did they actually do with that win? For about a decade, the American South had black majority governments, actual elected officials, formerly enslaved men, sitting in state legislatures, writing laws. And what they built with that power tells you everything about what socialism in America could have looked like. And it looks like nothing what you've been told to be afraid of. In South Carolina, 1868, for the first time in U.S. history, a state legislature had a black majority. And one of the first things they did was write a new state constitution that created the South's first system of free public education for everyone, black and white. Mississippi did the same thing, building a public school system from scratch for kids who had never been allowed to read. These governments built the South's first public hospitals, its first public health departments, to actually fight epidemics instead of letting poor communities die from them, orphanages, asylums for people who needed care, and they passed the first laws in American history banning racial discrimination on trains, hotels, and most public spaces, decades before anyone had heard the term civil rights. The North didn't even have these laws yet. Some northern states wouldn't pass their own public accommodation laws until the 1880s, after the Supreme Court struck down the Federal Civil Rights Act and the South's Reconstruction governments were already gone. For a brief window, the formerly enslaved South was more integrated by law than the free North. How did they pay for all this? They went straight for their planter class's land. The same men who'd built fortunes whipping human beings through cotton fields now had their land taxed at real value for the first time in the state's history. That money went straight into schools and hospitals for the people those planters used to own. This is what is missing from how we talk about socialism. Socialism isn't a man in a uniform telling you how many cows you're allowed to own. Socialism is when the people hold power, and the government answers to them instead of to property. It's a government that exists for the people, not for the people who own things. That's what public education for the people is. That's what a public hospital is. That's the planter class, the people who built their fortunes whipping human beings into the ground, suddenly forced to hand over their money to fund schools and hospitals for the very people they used to own. For the first time in American history, the people who used to extract everything were the ones getting extracted from. The wealth was starting to flow in the other direction. What happened in South Carolina in 1868 was power changing hands. It moved away from the people who owned property and toward the people who didn't. It was true representation. During Reconstruction, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 black officials held office across the South. Senators, congressmen. Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce became the first black U.S. senators in history. Louisiana had a black governor, PBS Pinchback. At the federal level, this period gave us the 14th and 15th Amendments in the Civil Rights Act of 1875. The first time the Constitution itself was written to say, explicitly, that more people count as citizens than it used to say. W.E.B. Du Bois, writing about all this in 1935, was upfront about how he saw it. He framed Reconstruction as a class struggle. On one side, you had labor, formerly enslaved black workers and poor white workers, who for a brief moment had real political power and used it to build public goods for poor blacks and whites. On the other side, you had capital, the planter class, whose entire fortune depended on a cheap, controlled labor force, and who stood to lose everything if this kept going. As good as all of this was, it wasn't even the most radical thing on the table. At the start of all this, there was a plan to give formerly enslaved families their own land, 40 acres and a mule to work it. General Sherman actually issued the order. Coastal land divided up and handed to freed families so they'd have something of their own, an actual economic foundation, not just a vote. It lasted less than a year. Andrew Johnson reversed it almost immediately and gave the land back to the men who used to own slaves. Everything else, the schools, the hospitals, the representation, was still standing on rented ground. The one thing that would have made it permanent, land, an actual stake in the country these people had just built, was the first thing taken away. What came next had a pattern to it. Without land, formerly enslaved families had no way to support themselves outside the plantation system. So they went back to working that same land, this time as sharecroppers and tenant farmers, trading labor for a share of the crop and a debt that never seemed to shrink. That land grab was the opening move in a longer campaign to put black labor back under control. The second move was quieter. Poor white workers in the South had the same basic problem black workers did: low wages and no power against the planter class. That's a shared interest on paper, but it never became one in practice. Du Bois explained why. White laborers were paid badly too, but on top of those low wages, they got what he called a public and psychological wage: better schools for their kids, access to public parks, leniency from police and courts that black workers never got, but none of that put extra money in anyone's pockets. But it was enough to keep two groups who needed each other from ever standing on the same side along class lines. Here's why the planter class bothered with any of this. A unified black and white labor movement in the South would have outnumbered them by a wide margin and could have broken their grip on land, wages, and local government for good. That kind of organizing was the real danger, and splitting black and white workers apart was the actual strategy planters pursued for decades. Then there's corruption. At the exact same time Reconstruction governments were being smeared as corrupt, New York's own political boss, William Tweed, was running a bribery machine so large that he and his partners stole something like $75 million. Up in Washington, the credit mobilier scandal had congressmen and a sitting vice president taking stock and bribes tied to railroad construction. A few years later, the whiskey ring was caught siphoning tax money with help from officials sitting inside Grant's own administration. White men in the North stealing fortunes. And yet newspapers and politicians across the country landed on a single explanation for corruption in the South. Not Tweed, not the railroad men. It was the fact that black Americans were engaging in the political process itself. The argument went that millions of formerly enslaved people now voting and holding office was the problem, as if 2.5 centuries of slavery had nothing to do with the conditions they inherited. In 1873, a financial crash hit the whole country. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, unemployment spread through the North. People who'd spent the last several years paying some attention to what was happening to black Americans in the South suddenly had their own problems. The conversation shifted from black citizenship to jobs and wages, and white workers up north increasingly saw black workers as competition instead of people fighting the same fight against the same employers. That shift in attention is what let Reconstruction lose whatever northern support it had left. While all of that was happening in newspapers and Congress, something more direct was happening on the ground. The Ku Klux Klan, the Red Shirts, and the White League, armed groups ran a campaign of organized terror across the South through the 1870s. They assassinated black officials, burned polling places, and attacked anyone who tried to keep these governments running. Du Bois put it like this: the United States, he wrote, was turned into a reactionary force. It became the cornerstone of a new imperialism. Look at what came right after. Within 20 years of abandoning black voters in the South, that same government was annexing Hawaii, occupying Cuba, and fighting a war in the Philippines that killed hundreds of thousands of people who never got a vote either. The machine that crushed democracy at home didn't retire. It just found new places to point itself. The United States as a government and a structure of force became that reactionary weapon. But the planters defending stolen wealth and the capitalists protecting their own profits weren't defending the country at all. We had already established what makes someone American: the people who fought, bled, and built something with their own hands. The men running this counter-revolution did none of that. They inherited fortunes built on slavery, or made new ones skimming railroad contracts and whiskey taxes, and then crushed the one government in American history actually run by and for the people who'd done the real work. Protecting their own property took more priority than living in a country by and for the people. Then it was finished off in a back room. The 1876 election between Hayes and Tilden was close enough to be disputed, and it got settled through a private deal. Hayes got the presidency, and the South got the last federal troops withdrawn, the ones still protecting what remained of Reconstruction. That trade is the entire compromise of 1877. One quiet agreement, and the federal government walked away from a project it had backed for a decade. The new state constitutions didn't vanish the moment the troops left, though. South Carolina's 1868 constitution stayed the law of the state for 27 years, until 1895. It took poll taxes, literacy tests, and an entirely new system of legal segregation to finally erase what these governments had built. Tearing something down piece by piece over 3 decades is not what failure looks like. That takes effort. That takes a campaign. There's one more piece that ties all of this together. On April 11th, 1865, 3 days before he was killed, Lincoln gave a speech where he said, for the first time as president, that some black Americans, veterans especially, should get the right to vote. John Wilkes Booth was standing in that crowd. He heard it, turned to the men next to him, and said that this was the last speech Lincoln would ever give, and 3 days later, he made sure of it. That assassination was the opening shot of the same war that played out for the next 12 years, blaming black political power for corruption it didn't cause, turning a financial crash into an excuse to look away, burning down polling places, cutting a deal in a back room to finish the job quietly. Different weapons, same target. That assassination was the opening shot of a war against everyone who'd sacrificed for this country, the people who built something real with their hands after centuries of bondage, the soldiers who died on both sides, and whatever Lincoln meant by a new birth of freedom. And none of it stayed in the past. The same weapon that split black and white workers apart in 1877 is still being used on us right now, just with new disguises. Race is still a wedge. It's just got more company now. Party, culture war, Whatever fight keeps you screaming at your neighbor instead of at the people robbing you both. Democrats and Republicans agree on almost nothing they'll say out loud, but they agree completely on funding the next war and protecting the people who own everything. Every dollar that goes into another occupation overseas is a dollar ripped straight out of your hospital bill and your kid's classroom. And while politicians cry poor over school lunches, there's always money for missiles, the kind that get launched at kids somewhere else in the world. That's the ruling class running the same play they've run for over a century. Keep us divided, keep us aimed at each other, and they never have to hand back a cent of what they've stolen. The coalition they broke apart in the 1870s has to be rebuilt now, across every line they've drawn since, to keep us fighting each other instead of them. That's the actual war. Reconstruction was a real attempt at something better, and reactionary forces killed it on purpose. The only question left is whether we finish what they started, or let the people who murdered it the first time keep winning. None of this is finished. America was never actually built into what it claims to be. Not in 1776, not after the Civil War, and not now. What we've had instead is a series of unfinished drafts, each one torn up by the people who profited from keeping it unfinished. Indigenous nations lived through their own version of that same broken promise. The federal government signed hundreds of treaties with native nations and broke nearly all of them. In 1887, it passed the Dawes Act, breaking up tribal land into individual parcels and selling off the rest to settlers. The same kind of theft that hit freed people a few years earlier, just stretched out over 50 years instead of one. By 1934, tribal land holdings had fallen from 138 million acres to 48 million. 2/3 gone. More proof this country was never finished what it promised. None of what's actually been built happened by accident or out of charity. In 1931, organizers backed by the Communist Party built the Sharecroppers Union in Tallapoosa County, Alabama, setting out to organize black and white tenant farmers together against the same landlords. White supremacist violence drove most of the white members out within 2 years, and the union kept fighting under black leadership anyway. The party ran the legal defense for the Scottsboro Boys when most of the country had already convicted them in the papers. In 1932, they put James Ford on the national ticket as their candidate for vice president, the first black American ever to run on one. 2 decades before either major party would let a black name anywhere near that kind of power. That fire didn't stay buried in the 1930s. In 1968, standing at Carnegie Hall on what would have been Du Bois's 100th birthday, King refused to keep hiding who Du Bois actually was. 2 months before he was killed, he told that room something most of America still won't say out loud. It is time to cease muting the fact that Dr. Du Bois was a genius and chose to be a communist. Our irrational, obsessive anti-communism has led us into too many quagmires to be retained as if it were a mode of scientific thinking. That's Martin Luther King, on stage, refusing to let fear decide who gets remembered as a hero. He wasn't confused about what the word meant. He understood it, and he understood that America's panic over it had been weaponized for decades to discredit anyone telling the truth about power. Dr. King was already getting more and more radicalized in his last years, towards a structural critique of capitalism itself, before he was killed for it. Finishing that turn means going where it was already headed, past civil rights and into full class struggle. Past asking the system to be fair and into building one that answers to labor instead of capital. This is the model worth looking at directly. The Soviet Union held over 100 different nationalities inside one state, and it didn't pretend that unity would just happen on its own. It built it, on purpose, as a political project. Russian and Uzbeks and Georgians and Chechens inside one revolutionary structure. China holds 56 recognized ethnic groups today under that same kind of deliberate construction. That's what a civilization actually is. A people built on purpose, out of every group inside its borders. Something deeper than just sharing a flag. America has never done that work. It's had a population since 1776, but it has never built itself into a civilization the way that the USSR did, the way that China has. What it's had instead is a country that papers over its divisions rather than building through them. That lets race and language and religion sit as fault lines instead of becoming the raw material for something whole. Finishing Reconstruction means finishing that job, building one people, one civilization, out of every group this country has ever tried to throw away. The capitalist class doesn't get to decide what this country becomes. They fund the missiles that fall on children in countries most Americans couldn't find on a map. They rape children. They didn't build anything here. They inherited it, or they bought it, or they stole it. And now they want credit for owning the flag too. The people who've actually done the building, the freed people, the sharecroppers, every communist organizer who went south to risk getting shot, have always been pragmatic. They've always been problem solvers. People who looked at something broken or something that never existed in the first place and built it anyway. Reconstruction proved this country could be built into something worth the name. Then it got torn up before the work was finished. We don't inherit a finished country. We build one. And that takes warriors.
Hey, thank you for watching these videos. I need your generous support so I can keep making these. I, like every other YouTuber, has a Patreon now where you can help support what I'm doing here, because I'm going to keep making videos because I love doing this. You'll be able to engage with me, you'll be able to suggest video topics, you'll be able to watch videos early, and you'll be giving me money so I can keep doing this, because I am very poor. Every little bit helps. So thank you for watching, and enjoy the rest of the video. So what does it mean to finish Reconstruction today? It means building working class power. Dual power. It means building free breakfast programs. It means building free hospitals. It means organizing your community, just like how the Black Panthers did it. It means uniting as a people and actually building dual power so we can live by the principles that America says it was built on. So we can live by the principles that the freedmen fought for. So we can build a multiracial, multi-ethnic American civilization. A civilization for the working class, and so we can unite under a common principle, one for the common good, for the workers, for the people who built it. This is how we honor their legacy. This is how we fight those who have ruined it. This is how we fight the warmongers and the bankers and those that keep us in debt and enslaved. Because despite all the war and bloodshed and murder that this country has engaged in, I still believe in this project. Just like the freedmen believed in the Reconstruction project. Just like the Panthers believed in their project. Just like Martin Luther King believed in his project. Because I know that the future belongs to the working class.